Today we have two tales of horror involving the end of summer at the lake. Light your candles, wrap that blanket around you tight, and prepare yourself. Story 1. The Last Night at Darkwood Lake.
As the end of summer crept closer, 5 friends, Emily, Sarah, Jessica, Amanda, and Rachel, decided to spend one last night together at Darkwood Lake. Nestled deep within the ancient Darkwood Forest, the lake lay on the outskirts of the small town of Ravenswood, Maine. It was surrounded by tall, foreboding pines that whispered secrets to those who dared to listen. Darkwood Lake had a reputation shrouded in mystery and whispered tales of disappearances and dark legends that no one ever talked about directly. They had heard the stories, of course, but the thrill of one final adventure proved too tempting. The girls, all 17 and about to start their senior year at Ravenswood High School, had been inseparable since childhood. Emily, the adventurous leader of the group, had bright red hair and a daring spirit. Sarah, her best friend, was more cautious but always up for a challenge, her dark hair usually tied back in a ponytail. Jessica, the storyteller with an imagination that often ran wild, had wavy brown hair and a penchant for the dramatic. Amanda, the practical one, kept the group grounded with her level-headedness and short blonde hair. Rachel, the gentle soul with long, flowing brunette locks, often served as the peacemaker among them. Darkwood Lake, originally known as Blackwater Lake, had a long and sinister history. Established as a settlement in the early 1800s, Ravenswood grew around the lake, which was a central part of the town's economy due to its abundant fishing and the dense, valuable timber from the surrounding forest. However, the lake was also the site of numerous unexplained disappearances and deaths, giving rise to a plethora of ghost stories and eerie legends. One of the most infamous tales was that of the Witch of Darkwood Lake. According to local lore, in the late 1800s, a woman named Eliza Blackwood, rumored to be a witch, was blamed for a series of misfortunes that plagued the town, crops failing, livestock dying, and a mysterious illness that swept through the population. The townsfolk, in a frenzy of fear and superstition, captured Eliza and drowned her in the lake, believing it would lift the curse. It was said that Eliza cursed the lake with her dying breath, vowing to haunt its waters and seek vengeance on those who trespassed. The sun dipped below the horizon as the girls set up their camp, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist among the trees. The air grew cooler, and the chirping of crickets filled the silence. Emily, ever the thrill-seeker, suggested a night swim. The others hesitated, glancing nervously at the dark water, but eventually agreed. They stripped down to their swimsuits and waded in, the cold water lapping at their skin. As they swam, a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring the shore. The moon, now hidden behind thick clouds, provided little light. The girls stayed close, their laughter echoing eerily across the still lake. Suddenly, Rachel let out a piercing scream. The others turned to see her thrashing in the water, her face contorted with fear. "Something touched me," she cried, her voice trembling. They all rushed to her, but found nothing beneath the surface. Trying to shake off the incident, they swam back to shore, their laughter now forced and nervous. The fog thickened as they gathered around the campfire, its flames casting ghostly figures in the mist. They tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, but it was impossible. Shadows seemed to move just beyond the firelight, and the forest was unnaturally silent. Sarah suggested telling ghost stories to lighten the mood, but the tales only heightened their anxiety. Jessica spoke of the Witch of Darkwood Lake. According to the legend, Eliza Blackwood's spirit remained bound to the lake, her wrathful ghost dragging the unwary to a watery grave. The girls laughed nervously, but the unease in their eyes was unmistakable. As the fire began to die down, Emily decided to fetch more wood. She ventured into the forest alone, the darkness swallowing her. The others waited, their nerves fraying with each passing minute. When Emily didn't return, panic set in. They called out her name, their voices trembling with fear, but only silence answered. Determined to find their friend, they grabbed flashlights and ventured into the forest. The beams of light cut through the fog, revealing twisted branches and shifting shadows. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent their hearts racing. They followed the faint path Emily had taken, but it seemed to stretch on forever, Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It was Emily. They ran towards the sound, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They found her at the edge of a clearing, her eyes wide with terror. "She's here," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "The witch. She wants us." As the forest closed in around them, the girls' terror grew palpable. Each step was heavier, each breath more labored, as if the very air conspired against their escape. The witch's malevolent presence was a suffocating shadow, her dark form almost blending into the fog that seemed alive with sinister intent. Emily was the first to fall. As she sprinted through the trees, branches clawing at her clothes, she stumbled upon a hidden marsh. The ground beneath her feet turned soft and treacherous. With every step, she sank deeper into the muck. Panic surged through her veins as the marsh became a voracious, living thing, pulling her down with unseen hands. She screamed for her friends, but the dense fog swallowed her cries. The last thing she saw was the witch's spectral face hovering above her, whispering curses as the mud and water filled her lungs, dragging her into the cold, dark embrace of the lake. Jessica was next. Separated from the group, she found herself in a thicket of twisted ancient trees. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and mock her fear. In her mind, the stories she had spun over the years merged into a horrifying reality. She felt a skeletal hand brush her arm, and when she turned, the witch was there, her eyes glowing with cruel delight. Roots erupted from the ground, ensnaring Jessica's legs and pulling her towards a dark pool that had materialized among the roots. She struggled, her screams echoing in the empty forest, but the roots wound tighter, dragging her under the surface. The water was black and icy, and as she fought for breath, she felt the witch's cold, bony fingers around her throat, squeezing until the darkness consumed her. Amanda, the practical and level-headed one, tried to keep calm, rationalizing that there had to be a way out. She stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin, hoping for refuge. Inside, the air was thick with decay, and the floorboards creaked ominously underfoot. She heard whispers, soft at first, then growing louder, an incomprehensible chorus of the damned. The door slammed shut behind her, and the windows darkened. Amanda turned to find herself face to face with the witch. Desperately, she ran through the cabin, but each door led her back to the same room. The walls began to close in, pressing tighter and tighter until she could hardly breathe. The last door led her to the lake, its surface a mirror and unyielding. The witch materialized, her hands outstretched. Amanda was lifted into the air and thrown into the lake. The water was like liquid death, and Amanda felt herself being pulled deeper and deeper by unseen forces, her eyes wide, her screams swallowed by the depths. Rachel found herself near the edge of the lake, the fog thick and cloying. She heard a voice calling her name, soft and familiar. It sounded like Emily, but distorted and wrong. Driven by a desperate hope, she followed the voice to the water's edge. The surface of the lake rippled, and for a moment she saw Emily's face, beckoning her closer. But as she reached out, the face twisted into a malevolent grin. Hands, cold and slimy, shot out from the water, gripping Rachel's arms and dragging her into the depths. The lake closed over her head, and she saw the faces of the drowned, twisted, agonized specters trapped beneath the water. The witch appeared among them, her eyes glowing with vengeful glee as she claimed Rachel for her own. Now only Sarah remained, running blindly through the forest, her mind a chaotic whirl of fear and desperation. She stumbled back to the campsite, where the dying embers of their fire offered a fleeting sense of safety. She collapsed, tears streaming down her face, when a cold hand gripped her shoulder. She turned, expecting the witch, but found herself alone. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, almost solidifying around her. She felt herself being lifted, an invisible force dragging her towards the lake. Sarah screamed, her voice breaking the stillness, but it was no use. The witch materialized before her, a ghastly smile on her skeletal face. "Your souls are mine," the witch hissed. The water of the lake churned and bubbled, a dark portal opening to claim its final victim. Sarah was pulled towards it, her fingers scraping the ground, her nails broken and bleeding, in a futile attempt to hold on. The witch's laughter echoed in her ears as the water closed over her head, cold and unrelenting. The last thing Sarah saw was the faces of her friends, cold, black, lifeless eyes as the darkness swallowed her whole. The next morning, the sun rose over Darkwood Lake, its waters calm and serene. The campsite was empty, the girls' belongings scattered as if they had left in a hurry. No one ever found out what happened to them, but the stories continued to be whispered among the locals. The legend of the Witch of Darkwood Lake grew, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. And so the summer ended, leaving behind only echoes of laughter and a chilling silence that would never be forgotten.
Now we come to our second story, The Mystery of Shadow Lake.
The serene waters of Shadow Lake, nestled in the heart of the small town of Pinewood, held an eerie calm that belied the horrors it had witnessed. The lake had been a favorite spot for locals to escape the summer heat, but the events of one fateful night in August 1965 would cast a dark shadow over its tranquil shores forever. It was the last weekend of summer, and 4 friends, Anna, Lisa, Mark, and Tom, decided to celebrate their freedom before school resumed. They had been inseparable since childhood, their bond forged through countless adventures and shared dreams. As the golden hues of late summer faded, they packed their camping gear and headed to Shadow Lake, excited for a night under the stars. Anna and Lisa were best friends, both 16 years old, sharing secrets and aspirations of the future. Anna was a thoughtful girl with a passion for writing, while Lisa was vibrant and full of life, her laughter infectious. Mark, Anna's boyfriend, was a quiet but strong presence in the group, always looking out for the others. He had a deep love for nature and often spoke of becoming a park ranger. Tom, at 18, was the oldest and the one they all looked up to. He had a charismatic personality, his smile capable of lighting up any room. They set up their tent near the water's edge, laughing and sharing stories as the sun dipped below the horizon. The girls gathered firewood while the boys prepared the campfire. As night fell, they roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on their faces. The atmosphere was filled with a sense of nostalgia and the bittersweet awareness that their carefree days were coming to an end. As the night deepened, a heavy silence enveloped the lake. The group settled into their sleeping bags, unaware of the eyes watching them with malevolent intent. The moon cast a pale light over the campsite, illuminating the tranquil surface of the lake, which mirrored the star-studded sky. The only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl and the gentle rustling of the leaves in the breeze. Tom lay wide awake, his eyes fixed on the tent's ceiling. A storm of emotions raged within him. He had always felt an inexplicable rage, a simmering anger that he struggled to contain. His thoughts were a chaotic whirl of jealousy, resentment, and a dark, twisted desire for control. He thought of Anna, her laughter, her closeness with Lisa, and the way she looked at Mark with such affection. A pang of envy twisted his gut. The darkness outside seemed to seep into his soul, feeding his malicious thoughts. The moonlight filtering through the tent cast long shadows that danced eerily on the canvas. He clenched his fists, his mind a tempest of irrational fury. Under the cover of darkness, something inside him broke. Around 3 a.m., the peaceful night was shattered by a series of muffled cries and the sound of rustling tent fabric. Tom, driven by a mix of jealousy and suppressed fury, attacked his friends with a knife and a heavy flashlight. He struck with swift brutality, his movements precise and lethal. Anna and Lisa were the first to be attacked. Tom moved silently, his shadow falling over them as he stood above their sleeping forms. He brought the knife down on Anna first, her eyes flying open in shock and pain. She tried to scream, but Tom's hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her cries. The blade plunged into her again and again, each thrust driven by his blinding rage. Lisa woke to the sound of the struggle, her eyes widening in horror as she saw Tom's frenzied assault on Anna. She tried to scramble away, but Tom was on her in an instant. The heavy flashlight came down on her head with a sickening thud. Her screams cut short as she fell into unconsciousness. He continued his assault, the knife gleaming wickedly in the moonlight as it tore into her flesh. Mark, waking to the commotion, tried to intervene but was overpowered by Tom's frenzied strength. Mark fought boldly with all the might he could muster, his eyes filled with confusion and betrayal. But Tom's fury was unstoppable. The knife slashed through the air, meeting Mark's desperate attempts to defend himself with brutal efficiency. Blood sprayed across the tent, mingling with the shadows and turning the scene into a nightmarish tableau of violence and death. Tom, his breathing ragged and his eyes wild, stood amidst the carnage. The bodies of his friends lay around him, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. The realization of what he had done began to seep into his consciousness, and a cold dread settled over him. He stumbled out of the tent, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. In a desperate bid to cover his tracks and create the illusion of being a victim, he stabbed his leg in a cry of agony. Leaving the knife in his leg, he hobbled over to a tree stump. He laid his left hand palm down, and with all his might brought down the flashlight with a severe blow. His wrist shattered and went limp. The pain was excruciating, and then everything went black. The following morning, a fisherman discovered the gruesome scene. The early morning light cast long shadows over the campsite, revealing the full extent of the horror that had unfolded. Anna and Lisa lay lifeless inside the tent, their bodies bearing multiple stab wounds. Mark was found nearby, his skull fractured, and his body covered in deep cuts. Tom, miraculously alive, was found outside the tent, unconscious and severely injured. The fisherman, his face pale and his hands trembling, ran to the nearest house to call the police. The small town of Pinewood was soon buzzing with the news of the gruesome discovery. Shock and disbelief rippled through the community as people gathered near the lake, their faces etched with horror and confusion. The Pinewood police were quickly summoned, but the investigation was hindered from the start. The crime scene was trampled by curious townsfolk, destroying crucial evidence. Despite extensive questioning and a thorough search, no clear suspect emerged. Tom, with his convincing story of a mysterious assailant, became a figure of sympathy rather than suspicion. His injuries, his calm demeanor, and his lack of clear motive convinced many of his innocence. The town was left in a state of shock and fear, with everyone wondering who among them could commit such a heinous act. Rumors and speculation ran rampant, but the truth remained elusive. The once peaceful community was now haunted by the specter of violence and betrayal. Tom Sanders, the lone survivor, initially seen as a victim, began to arouse suspicion as new details emerged. Decades later, advancements in forensic technology led to his arrest. The prosecution argued that Tom, in a drunken rage, had attacked his friends. However, after a lengthy trial, he was acquitted due to insufficient evidence, his calm demeanor, and lack of clear motive convincing the jury of his innocence. The town remained divided, some believing in his guilt, while others were convinced of his innocence. The lake's waters, once a source of solace and recreation, now seemed to reflect the dark memories of that night. The townsfolk, though they tried to move on, could never fully escape the shadow cast by the murders. The story of Shadow Lake became another chapter in the long history of unsolved mysteries, a tale told in hushed tones around campfires, ensuring that the memories of Anna, Lisa, and Mark live on, even as their spirits rest uneasily in the cool depths of the lake.
Thank you for taking the time to watch and listen to these terrifying tales. Hopefully you enjoyed yourself and we earned your subscription today. Like, share, hit the bell, and subscribe. Good evening.